She carried a silver tray through the mansion, her worn shoes squeaking on the polished floor. Laughter erupted behind her. The rich daughters of the house pointed and mocked, calling her dirty, uneducated, nothing more than a maid. Guests joined in, some amused, some embarrassed. She lowered her eyes, staying silent. What no one knew was that this woman they humiliated owned more than they could ever imagine. When people looked at her, all they saw was a maid, a woman in a plain uniform, carrying trays, scrubbing floors, moving silently from room to room. They never wondered who she was before she came here. They never cared. To them, she was invisible. But behind those lowered eyes was a story far deeper than the dust she swept away. She was born into poverty, in a small home where food was often scarce and every coin mattered. As a child, she watched her mother stitch clothes late into the night just to keep the family alive. She learned early that life was never going to hand her anything. If she wanted more, she would have to fight for it in silence. That silence became her shield. When she grew older, she took the job as a maid in the mansion. She didn't choose it out of pride. She chose it out of necessity. The pay was small, but it was steady, and with it she could survive. Every day she served the family. She endured. The whispers, the mocking laughs, the looks of superiority from the daughters of the house. They called her dirty. They called her uneducated. They made jokes at her expense right in front of guests, as if she couldn't feel the sting of every word. But what they never understood was that every insult became fuel. She would retreat to her small room after long hours of work, sit on the edge of her narrow bed, and open books she borrowed or bought second-hand. She studied in secret, basic business lessons, simple accounting, strategies for saving and investing. The mansion slept while she lit her lamp and whispered numbers into the dark. Her co-workers laughed at her for studying. They said, "Why learn these things? You'll always be a maid." But she never answered. She only smiled quietly and went back to her pages. She lived carefully, almost painfully frugal. While others wasted money on fleeting comforts, she saved every coin she could. She packed leftovers for her meals. She walked instead of taking transport. She denied herself luxuries so she could collect tiny pieces of freedom. Years passed like this. Her sacrifices unseen, her effort unnoticed. Then came her first chance. With the savings she had, she bought a small piece of land in a forgotten corner of the city. It wasn't much, but to her it was the beginning of everything. She rented it out and watched her savings grow. Slowly, brick by brick, she built more. A small rental home here, another property there, all registered quietly under her name. No one in the mansion had the faintest idea. To them, she was still just the maid who cleaned after their parties and bowed when they entered the room. And yet inside, she was becoming something else. She was becoming an owner, a provider, a woman who was turning pain into power. Each time the daughters called her poor, she thought of the tenants who paid her rent on time. Each time they called her uneducated, she thought of the lessons she taught herself at night. Each time they tried to break her dignity, she thought of the empire she was quietly building behind their backs. They thought I was powerless, she whispered to herself as she folded sheets or washed dishes. But I am building something they could never imagine. Those words became her secret mantra. And every day she served their meals or polished their silver. She carried those words in her heart like a hidden crown. The rich family never suspected a thing. In their eyes, she would always be beneath them, trapped in the dust of their mansion. They laughed, they mocked, they carried on with their perfect lives. But in truth, she was the one moving forward, step by step, while they stood still. The years of struggle hardened her spirit, but they never killed her kindness. She was hurt by the disrespect, yes, but she did not let it make her bitter. Instead, she let it sharpen her determination. She was proof that sometimes the strongest people are the ones who learn to stay silent while the world underestimates them. And so, when the daughters raised their glasses at yet another party and laughed about her pitiful life, she only smiled to herself, because she knew something they did not. She knew that one day the balance of power would shift, and when that day came, it would not be her begging for mercy. It would be them. Her backstory was not just about suffering. It was about survival, resilience, and the quiet rise of a woman who refused to stay broken. She had built her strength in the shadows, preparing for the moment when her truth would finally be revealed. And that moment was coming faster than anyone expected, because while she grew stronger in silence, the family she served was walking straight toward their own downfall. The mansion was alive with music again, chandeliers glowing above polished floors, the air filled with perfume and laughter. Guests in sparkling gowns and sharp suits gathered in the hall, sipping champagne, whispering about business, fortune, and wealth. And as always, she moved quietly among them, carrying trays, clearing glasses, unseen and unimportant in their eyes. But tonight something was different. Tonight the daughters were restless, eager to put on a show at her expense. One of them caught sight of her as she passed by, balancing a tray of crystal glasses with steady hands. The daughter's lips curled into a cruel smile. Loud enough for the guests to hear, she said, "Look at her. Our maid has been here for years, and yet she still can't even speak like an educated woman." The guests shifted. Some chuckled politely. Others looked away in discomfort. She lowered her eyes, her heart tightening, but her steps never faltered. The second daughter leaned in, pretending to whisper but making sure her voice carried. "Do you know what's funny? She probably thinks cleaning up after us is an achievement. Maybe she should take lessons from us. We could teach her how to use a fork properly, how to dress, maybe even how to read." The laughter around them grew louder, echoing off the marble walls. Inside she felt the sting. Silent fury rose in her chest, mixing with the deep sadness she had carried for years. But her face remained calm. She had trained herself well, never to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Her silence was her armor, though behind that stillness her thoughts burned. If only they knew who really owned the ground beneath their feet. Then, as if mocking her dignity wasn't enough, the youngest daughter decided to humiliate her further. She swirled her glass of red wine, and with a calculated flick of her wrist, spilled it across the maid's uniform. Gasps erupted from the guests as the crimson liquid spread like a stain of cruelty across the fabric. The daughter laughed, tossing her hair back. "Oh no, look what you've done. Better get on your knees and clean it up, maid. That's what you're here for, isn't it?" The room fell silent, except for the cruel laughter of the daughters. Guests shifted uncomfortably, some whispering behind their hands. A few looked at the maid with pity, but none dared to defend her. She stood there frozen for a moment, the wine dripping from her dress, her hands trembling just slightly as she clutched the empty tray. Inside, the fury roared louder, but her face remained steady. She bent down slowly, dabbing at the mess with a cloth, every movement precise, every breath controlled. "Know your place, maid," one of the daughters sneered, her voice slicing through the silence. "Even your clothes smell of poverty. You'll never be more than this." Those words cut deeper than the wine that stained her uniform. They cut because they were meant to crush her spirit in front of everyone. But instead of breaking, she felt something shift inside. The sadness hardened into resolve. The fury cooled into steel. They thought they were destroying her, but all they were doing was lighting the fire she had kept hidden for so long. As she wiped the floor, she thought to herself, "If only you knew. If only you knew that while you laugh, I own more than you could dream. If only you knew that the land you stand on is mine." Her heart beat faster, not from shame this time, but from the knowledge of what was coming. She rose to her feet, her head still bowed, her lips pressed into silence. The daughters smirked, satisfied with their performance, and turned back to their guests as if nothing had happened. The party moved on, the music swelled, but beneath the glitter and gold, a storm was forming. Because this humiliation was different. It was public, it was deliberate, and it pushed her to the edge of what she could endure. She had carried years of insults quietly, building her strength in the shadows, waiting for the right moment. And tonight, as she walked away with the stain still fresh on her dress, she knew that moment was close. Her silence no longer felt like weakness. It felt like power, coiled tight, waiting to be unleashed. The daughters thought they had humiliated her beyond repair, but what they had really done was seal their own fate. Their cruelty had set the stage. Their arrogance had written the script, and soon, very soon, she would reveal a truth that would shatter their perfect world. The guests whispered long after the wine had been cleaned. Some pitied her, some judged her, but none could see the quiet strength in her eyes. None could hear the promise in her heart, a promise that the next time the daughters laughed, it would not be at her expense. It would be their downfall. And so the night ended, with music fading and guests drifting away, the mansion glowing under the moon. The daughters celebrated another victory of mockery, convinced they were untouchable. But she walked back to her small room, her steps calm, her face unreadable, her spirit burning brighter than ever. She knew their empire was crumbling, and when it finally collapsed, she would be there to step forward. This cruel moment had pushed her to the brink, but it also prepared her for what came next. The family's downfall was approaching, and when it arrived, her hidden strength would rise into the light. The game was about to change forever. The glitter of the mansion began to fade. The chandeliers still sparkled. The marble floors still shone. But behind closed doors, the family's world was falling apart. Rumors whispered through the city about debts unpaid, about investments gone wrong, about creditors knocking at the gates of the once untouchable household. What had seemed like endless wealth was now crumbling like sand between their fingers. The daughters, who once paraded through parties in jewels and silk, now sat in the grand sitting room with fear written across their faces. Their laughter was gone, replaced with frantic whispers and trembling hands. Bills lay scattered on the table, letters from banks, demands from creditors, numbers written in red that no amount of pretending could erase. Their father's empire, built on pride and arrogance, was collapsing faster than they could control. One daughter slammed her hand against the table, her voice breaking. "We're losing everything. What do we do now?" The others looked at each other with wide eyes, their arrogance stripped away, replaced with helplessness. They had always mocked others for being poor, but now they were tasting that same fear, and for the first time, they realized they had no idea how to survive without the wealth they had taken for granted. The maid stood silently in the corner, holding a tray she didn't really need to hold. She had been called into the room to serve tea, but no one touched the cups. The daughters were too lost in their panic to even notice her. She listened quietly, her calm presence a sharp contrast to their chaos. Inside, her heart beat steady, not from fear, but from the certainty that her moment was near. She watched the family crumble, the same family who had laughed at her, insulted her, humiliated her in front of strangers. They had called her dirty, uneducated, less than human. But here they were, with all their riches slipping through their fingers, and not one of them knew what to do. For years she had carried their cruelty in silence, building her strength in the shadows. And now the shadows were shifting. One daughter buried her face in her hands, sobbing. What if we lose the mansion? What if they take everything from us? Another paced the room, her voice high with panic. There has to be someone we can call, someone who can help us. We can't let this happen. Their fear filled the room, thick and heavy, while she stood steady, her back straight, her face serene. In that moment, she felt no sadness for them. Instead, she felt something powerful rising inside her. She was no longer the humiliated maid they thought they controlled. She was the woman who had built her own foundation, brick by brick, while they wasted their fortune on vanity and pride. She was the one who knew what true strength looked like. The father stormed into the room, his face pale, his voice sharp. "It's worse than we thought," he muttered, slamming another paper onto the table. "The creditors will be here by the end of the week. We can't stop it. We are ruined." The daughters cried out, clinging to him, begging for answers he didn't have. The once proud man who had ruled his household with iron confidence now stood trembling, powerless. And there, in the corner, the maid lowered the tray onto the side table. She stepped forward just slightly, her eyes calm, her voice steady, though she spoke barely above a whisper. "Maybe," she said, "it's time you finally saw who I really am." Her words cut through the noise of panic like a blade. The daughters froze, their tear-streaked faces turning toward her. The father lifted his head, his brows furrowed in confusion. For the first time, they looked at her not as an object, not as invisible, but as someone who had spoken with a weight they could not ignore. Inside her heart burned with a quiet triumph. This was the moment she had been waiting for. Years of silence, of humiliation, of swallowing her pain, had led to this. The power she had built in secret was ready to come into the light. She was no longer a servant in this story. She was the storm they never saw coming. The room hung heavy with silence, broken only by the ticking of the old clock on the wall. The family stared at her, their confusion mixing with fear, unsure of what she meant. But she knew exactly what she meant. She knew that soon their world would be turned upside down. She looked at the daughters, once so arrogant, now trembling and desperate. She looked at the father, his hands shaking, his pride shattered, and she felt a calmness settle over her like never before. She did not need to raise her voice. She did not need to humiliate them as they had humiliated her. All she needed to do was reveal the truth, and that truth was coming. Step by step, moment by moment, the mask she had worn for years was slipping away. The stage was set. The audience was in place. The downfall of the rich family had already begun, and she was about to deliver the final blow. As she stood there, serene and unshaken, the daughters whispered among themselves, fear in their voices. The father demanded answers, but none came. Only her silence filled the room, a silence stronger than their screams. She let them feel that silence. She let them taste the fear of not knowing, because soon she would speak again. And when she did, her words would shatter the illusion of their power forever. The maid they mocked was gone. In her place stood a woman they would never forget. And with her next breath, she would lead the story into the moment of truth, the moment where everything they thought they knew would crumble at her feet. The air in the mansion was heavy, thick with dread. The family had gathered in the great hall, the very place where laughter and music once echoed during parties. Now it was quiet, except for the nervous shuffling of feet and the whispers of a few guests who had stayed behind, curious about the rumors swirling around the house. Everyone could see it. The once proud family was crumbling, and in the corner of the room, standing with calm eyes and steady hands, was the maid they had always mocked. The father's voice trembled as he tried to explain their situation to the guests, blaming the markets, blaming misfortune, blaming anyone but himself. The daughters clung to each other, pale and shaken, their perfect faces streaked with tears. And then through the tension, she stepped forward, not rushing, not stumbling, but with quiet confidence that silenced the room. Every eye turned to her, the maid they had ignored for years. She placed a neat folder on the polished table, her hands graceful, her expression calm. Slowly she spread the papers across the surface, deeds, contracts, bank statements, all carrying her name. The room went still. No one spoke. The daughters leaned forward, their eyes darting over the words, disbelief spreading across their faces. The father's jaw tightened as he picked up one of the documents, his hand shaking as he read the truth aloud. These properties, they belong to you?" he stammered, his voice cracking. She looked at him steadily, her voice strong but calm. "Yes. Several rental homes, a company that grows larger every year. And this," she said, tapping one document with her finger. "This is the land you built this mansion on. You mocked me for being poor. You never realized you were standing on ground that partly belongs to me." Gasps echoed through the hall. The guests leaned closer, eyes wide, their curiosity turning into awe. The daughters staggered back, their faces pale as snow. Just hours ago they had laughed at her, spilled wine on her, called her uneducated, and now the truth was undeniable. The maid straightened her shoulders, years of shame lifting from her body. For so long she had been forced to bow her head, to swallow her pride. But now, in this very moment, she stood taller than all of them. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer their servant in the shadows. She was the woman who had outgrown them all. Her voice carried across the room, calm but sharp as glass. "The maid you laughed at," she said, "is richer than all of you." The words struck like lightning. The daughters flinched, their lips trembling, their arrogance shattered. One of them whispered, her voice shaking, This can't be true." But the papers in front of them were proof. The signatures, the seals, the numbers, all undeniable. The guests who once laughed at the maid now looked at her with respect, even admiration. Whispers filled the room again, but this time they were whispers of awe. She stepped closer, her eyes fixed on the daughters who had tormented her for years. "I was never just your servant," she said, her tone calm but heavy with power. "I was your future landlord." The daughters gasped, shame and regret washing over their faces. They looked down, unable to meet her eyes, and then she gave them the final blow, the line that would echo in their minds forever. Her voice softened, but her words carried more weight than anything else she had spoken. "Respect is worth more than money," she said, pausing long enough for the silence to wrap around her. "And I have both." The hall erupted with whispers again. Some guests clapped softly, others simply stared, stunned by the revelation. The father lowered his head, unable to speak. The daughters stood frozen, humiliated, in the very same place they had once humiliated her. Inside, she felt no need to laugh at them, no need to return cruelty with cruelty. The truth itself was enough. The reversal was complete. For years she had endured their arrogance in silence. Now they would carry the memory of this moment for the rest of their lives. She gathered her papers slowly, every movement deliberate, every step a declaration of dignity. She no longer felt the sting of their insults. She no longer carried the weight of their laughter. She was free, proud, and untouchable. The guests parted as she walked toward the door, their eyes following her with respect. They no longer saw her as a maid. They saw her as a woman of strength, a woman who had risen higher than anyone expected. Behind her, the family sat in silence, their world shattered. The daughter's arrogance had dissolved into shame, their pride into regret, and the father, who once commanded the mansion with power, sat powerless, speechless, and broken. The maid stepped out of the great hall with her head held high. She had revealed the truth. She had claimed her power, and she knew that from this moment on, nothing would ever be the same. The balance had shifted. The humiliation she had once endured was over. Now it was the family's turn to feel the sting of shame, and with her calm, powerful revelation, the story was ready to move toward its final lesson, the moral that would linger long after the doors of the mansion closed. The hall was silent. The papers had been laid down, the truth revealed, and the balance of power shifted forever. The daughters who once mocked her sat slumped in their chairs, their faces pale, their eyes lowered. For years they had laughed at her, treated her as less than human, but now they couldn't even lift their gaze to meet hers. Their arrogance was gone, replaced with shame that weighed heavier than the jewels they used to flaunt. Guests who had witnessed it all leaned close to one another, whispering in awe. Their eyes no longer looked down at the maid. Instead, they followed her with respect, even admiration. Some smiled faintly, as if silently applauding her strength. Others simply shook their heads, stunned at the revelation that the woman they once ignored had built a life far greater than the family she served. And through it all, she stood calm. She did not gloat. She did not raise her voice. Her triumph was not in mocking them, they had mocked her. Her triumph was in her dignity, in the grace with which she carried her victory. She was proof that revenge did not always need to be loud or cruel. Sometimes, the greatest revenge was simply revealing the truth and letting silence do the rest. She gathered her documents slowly, each fold deliberate, each gesture calm. She moved with elegance, no longer the invisible servant scurrying in the background. Every step declared who she truly was now. A woman of power, of independence, of unshakable strength. Her humiliation was over. Her silence had spoken louder than all their laughter combined. The father cleared his throat as if to speak, but no words came. His pride was shattered, his authority gone. The daughters clutched at each other, searching for comfort but finding none. They had been humbled in front of their guests, stripped of their superiority, forced to face the truth that the maid they despised had risen higher than them. She looked at them one last time, her gaze steady but not cruel. There was no need for hatred. They had already destroyed themselves with their arrogance. She had no desire to add to their shame. Instead, she offered them something far heavier than anger. Her calm silence, because silence in that moment was the sharpest answer she could give. Her voice, when she finally spoke again, was soft, but carried through the room. Never underestimate a woman who suffers in silence, she said, her eyes sweeping over the guests, then landing back on the family. She's building strength you can't imagine. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and not one person dared to interrupt. The guests nodded, some even clapping lightly, as if her words had struck a chord deep within them. They understood the lesson. They had seen with their own eyes how arrogance crumbles and how quiet resilience rises stronger than gold. She stepped toward the doors of the great hall, her head held high. Her footsteps echoed against the marble, each one marking the end of her years as a servant. She was no longer walking away in silence. She was walking into a new life, carrying dignity that no one could ever strip from her again. Behind her, whispers filled the room. She's stronger than any of us realized. She's not just a maid. She's more powerful than this family ever was. Respect replaced ridicule, and admiration replaced mockery. She had rewritten her story in front of them all, and they would carry that memory long after she was gone. The daughters sat frozen, their hands trembling, their tears falling quietly. They remembered every cruel word they had spoken, every laugh they had forced at her expense. Now those memories burned them with shame. They wanted to speak, to apologize, but their voices failed. They were left with silence, the same silence they had once mocked her for. She reached the doors and paused, turning just enough to let her final words carry through the hall. "Riches mean nothing without respect," she said, "and I have both." The doors opened, and she walked out with grace, leaving the family behind to face the ruins of their pride. The moral of her story was clear, written not in speeches but in actions. True power does not come from wealth or status or the arrogance of looking down on others. True power comes from resilience, from hard work, from the quiet determination to rise above cruelty without becoming cruel yourself. As she disappeared into the night, the guests knew they had witnessed something rare, a story of revenge that was not about shouting or fighting back, but about patience, dignity, and strength. The maid had proven that respect is worth more than money, and that a woman underestimated is often the one destined to rise the highest. The mansion behind her would never be the same. The daughters would live with their shame. The father would live with his regret, and the guests would carry the lesson with them, whispering it for years to come. But she walked away free, her spirit unbroken, her dignity intact, her future brighter than ever, because in the end, she had won. And she had won not by becoming like them, but by becoming greater. The woman they thought was powerless had shown them all the true meaning of strength.